And now I would like to present Dorje Kirsten. Dorje is a professional astrologer based in Portland, Oregon, where he lives with his wife and children. He has read charts professionally since 2006, after spending 12 years studying Buddhism at the Chengdu Gunpa Foundation and Nyingma Retreat Center. Alongside his astrological work, Dorje is a certified tea master, a software engineer, and a 32-degree Mason. He is currently completing the OPA Counseling Astrology certification. His practice focuses on integrating traditional astrology techniques with modern, soul-centered spiritual, philosophical, cultural, historical, and psychological perspectives. Dorje has studied with noted teachers, including Bernadette Brady, earning certificates of accomplishment from Brady's Astrologos Medieval and Predictive Astrology schools, as well as Joseph Crane and Kay Taylor. Quite the lineage, Dorje. His writing has appeared in The Evolving Astrologer, The Mountain Astrologer, and in an anthology, Changing of the Guard, which was published recently. It's excellent. I highly recommend it. And it explores the historic shifts that occur as Pluto enters Aquarius. You can find his work on his website on the World Wide Web at heartastrology.com. His astrology meditations on his Substack, Dorje Kirsten, and his astrology videos on YouTube at Heart Astrology. Also, Twitter/X at Dorje Padma, IG at Heart Astrology 168, and Blue Sky at Heart Astrology. Dorje uses the tropical system and as well as whole sign houses. And with that, I invite you to share your screen, Dorje, and take it away.
Thank you very much, Mary. That's quite the introduction. And hello, everybody. Happy to be here. Thank you for coming. This talk presentation covers a huge amount of history and the motions and the movements of astrology as defined and expressed through Pluto moving through the signs. It's very vast in its what it encompasses. And so I hope that you follow along and enjoy. Please put questions in the chat and I'll answer them at the end. First of all, I'd like to start out by defining a little bit what the world soul is. The idea of the world soul, as far as we can tell, comes from written records that first arose in the works of Timaeus by Plato. A good working definition of the world soul is the living intelligence that animates the cosmos, the subtle unifying consciousness that binds all forms of existence into one interdependent organism. In Platonic and Hermetic thought, it is the intermediary between the eternal realm of the divine and the transient realm of matter, infusing creation with order, rhythm, and meaning. Every planet, stone, animal, and human participates in this vast and souled unity, expressing a particular facet of the cosmic mind. Astrology can be said to be a symbolic language through which the world soul speaks, the pattern reflection of its intentions made visible by the movements of the heavens and mirrored within the psyche of humankind. Humanity as a group, then, expresses itself inseparably through the world soul in this view. The risings and fallings of emperors, empires, queens, kings, presidents, the coming and going of spiritual dogmas, ideas, philosophies, political ideas, technologies, and morals are all expressions of the arc of the story that we are witness to as humans and co-creators of in our experience of the world soul. It is through the study of astrology that we can gain a better understanding of the narrative of the world soul, understanding its nature and curves. A challenge for us humans as we live such short, minuscule lifespans is understanding the arcs of history and the progression of the world soul and its mythologies. Not only that, but during the transition of our short lives from birth to death, should we be fortunate enough to live long enough, we ourselves will also undergo experiences of perceiving the changes in the world soul and how it evolves. This, of course, can be represented in the astrology chart, by the ingresses of planetary progressions, solar arc directions, as well as the motions of the outer planets through the signs and houses in our own nativities. However, in the same way, if we consider the whole of humanity as a living being, part of the consciousness of the world, transforming through transits and cycles of outer planets can be seen as tools for recognizing the transformation of a particular subject that humanity experiences, such as astrology, in the minds of the humans that practice it and express it. Now, this brings up the idea of the fluidity of knowledge, which I'd like to touch in before moving further on. It's a challenge that we face as humans, that every generation we view ourselves as being the most intelligent and knowledgeable people that have ever existed in the arc of humanity. We tend to look at the world through our own lens of intellectual and moral values, understanding ourselves as gifted and knowledgeable, looking historically and seeing the ignorance of people who lived in the past. I like to term this the fluidity of knowledge because the people in the past saw those who came before them as ignorant. So, who really are the ignorant ones if you look over the course of humanity? Over the course of time, what we know as fact, such as the Earth being round, may become a new fact or agreement, such as the Earth being flat. And then in further generations, it might come around to being round again. And so this is how what we understand changes as a human whole. The fluidity of knowledge creates challenges in understanding the changes and views of historical times. We understand history not objectively, but subjectively from our own perspective. One of the advantages of looking at history through the lens of astrology is that it gives us a foundational perspective of archetypes of the zodiac and the planets that can help us have a common language in discussing the transformations of the human experience through time. I would also like to note that the fluidity of knowledge occurs within ourselves too, as what we believe and hold to be true when we're in our 20s is completely different than what we believe and hold to be true in our 50s or 60s, 70s, or 80s. And this also can be seen within the astrology chart, but the focus of this presentation is on the mundane world and how astrology changes as Pluto moves through its signs. Before the discovery and integration of Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto into astrology, the study of observing how humanity changed was done by the examination of the great cycle of Jupiter and Saturn. In this cycle, there are 240-year periods where two planets conjunct one another predominantly in the single element or trigon. This allows for us to review the history with agreed upon definitions. It also allowed astrologers to make predictions about what would be coming in future epochs and what those elements would bring with them. It's harder to predict the future because while symbols of astrology are always accurate, there are many invariants. I believe this is what Richard Tarnas, a strong proponent of astrology as a tool for cultural understanding, meant by multivariants in his works. For example, it would have been hard to predict that the current air trigon would be a sign of mass surveillance and drone warfare and artificial intelligence even 40 or 50 years ago. But here we are. The Great Conjunction is in an air trigon in Aquarius, and that is what we have in our world. But it would also be easy to look in retrospect and to understand the Great Conjunction, say, of a water trigon from 1425 to 1663 was a time of mass ocean exploration and global discovery through that ocean exploration and the element of water. With the cycles of Pluto, Neptune, and Uranus, astrologers now have tremendous tool to study the cultural cycles of history. Pluto takes 248 years to go around the zodiac, averaging close to 20 years in each sign. In its own magnificent way, this elucidates the study of the cycle of generations, which are commonly given 20 years in duration. With Pluto taking an average of 20 years in a sign and generationally marked in 20-year spans, Pluto becomes an excellent source of understanding generational approaches and generational views. Pluto in Leo, yes, those baby boomers, they do not want to step down, huh? They want to hold on to being the center of attention. Those dutiful and ever complaining Gen Xers who had Pluto in Virgo from 1958 to 1972. You were born during a time of dutiful turmoil where the maintaining of outer appearance of virtue was paramount, and shadows of the slight, sloppy psyche were kept well hidden by Mama's little helper. Pluto in Libra from 1972 to 1984 saw the blossoming of therapy culture as well as the development of the fashionable paparazzi appearances. It's probably easier to maybe tell where someone's Pluto is than their rising sign just by looking at them, how they dress, how they talk, how they speak, and how they approach the world. To be honest, and that is even with modern advancements in plastic surgery. Are there any Pluto and Scorpios listening today? That would be 84 to 95, which was oddly enough also the peak of goth music, a very scorpionic thing. How did that affect your psyche and the way you look at the world and your ability to trust others? We can look at every generation through this lens, not to define others, but to understand our motivation and the motivations of those who we interact with better, to understand where they're coming from and to know where we're coming from. Take a moment then, put in your chat if you want to, how you feel the location of where Pluto is in your chart has affected you and your psyche and those who you were born with. Human beings are creatures of interdependent origination. And here you see a slide of the wheel of life in Buddhism. This concept is explained very well in Buddhism. The understanding of this is that we are created from genetic, environmental circumstances and factors that come from random karma. It works very well with the practice of astrology to think about humans as being products of interdependent origination. Look at an astrology chart. There's no self in it. Well, I mean, some sign astrologers might argue that the self is the sun, but you'll see that there are planets. They are composed in parts of the psyche and how it expresses itself. There's asteroids and centaurs, if you're into that kind of thing. There's fixed stars. There are endless points composing how the self is formed, each one of them describing factors that were at play when you were born. But there is no actual center to the chart. It's a round circle, and every single one of those points and planets interrelates with one another, having a say in your experience at any given point in time. Sure, evolutionary astrologers, they might be like, well, it's the north node that you're growing to and the south node you're coming from. But what is growing to that north node? What is coming from that south node? Where is Pluto as the descriptor of the soul? But what are all the other parts of the soul expressed by the placements of the planets that are talking to that Pluto? Or if you're more into the sun as being the location of the self in the chart, then how is it being affected and pulled by all the other planets from the moment you're born, expressed in the nativity? Each one of them describes factors that were at play when you were born, how they interacted with the world through your current transits now, how they form your thoughts, your emotions, your physical expressions, and what you call yourself, which is a really interesting idea. Is there really a self represented in the astrology chart? Traditional astrology might look at the Hamilton figurist, the Hamilton of the soul, to say, well, this is the self. But it too is just formed of all these different parts that create the interdependent being that is you moving through life, being pulled on by different factors. Now, this brings us back to the world soul. The world soul as a concept can be contemplated as an expression of the physical, emotional, and thought processes of the totality of all beings on earth witnessing themselves. Students of astrology understand this is expressed, whether by casual factors or divine intention, doesn't really matter because it's expressed through the motion, harmonies, and symbolic forms of the stars, the planets, the luminaries, the asteroids, the centaurs, if you use them. As astrologers, we can take any combination of these as a lens to understand the unfolding of the world around us, the motions of the generations, and our place as individuals who contribute to the creative unfolding of the symbiotic whole of being. In this talk, Pluto is being approached as an expression of the world soul's impetus to understand itself through the conscious art of astrology. As short-lived humans, we are going to only experience, if we're lucky, 4 or 5 Pluto signs in our lifetime. Maybe if we're very lucky, 6. Well, maybe if longevity technology really kicks in, 6 or 7. But that's a promise that hasn't manifested yet. When the signs shift, when Pluto shifts through the signs, there's a shift of focus and intent. This is true in astrology. This creates all kinds of morbid difficulties for astrologers because we become identified with a particular school or style of astrology that we resonate with as we enter the art and practice of astrology. And if we fixate on that, then we might start arguing with other astrologers about what school is best or true, which one is correct. The underlying assumption here is that there is one absolute truth, that there is one form of astrology that can describe that absolute truth. Of course, this is an absurd proposition. We've just gone over interdependence and how there are many different parts that make up a whole, and those parts are always changing and transforming. So this problem leads to a rigid mind. And one thing I'd like to,
George,
yes.
excuse me, I'm sorry to interrupt, but we're on the same slide for a while, and I just want to make sure you know that you know we've been on the Avatam Saka Sutra slide, and you haven't been advancing to any others. I just wanted to double check with you.
Well, thank you, Mary, for bringing the humbleness to my presentation. I flipped into it slightly too early, and I'm flipping out of it in the next sentence.
Okay, thank you.
I suppose the fixed signs would not see it as a problem to take one point of view and argue with it. But being ruled by Mercury myself, it just drives me crazy when my social media feed is bombarded with arguments about what school of astrologies are better. Now let's talk about Pluto and the Trigons. As we will see, there is a correlation between Pluto and the promise and techniques of astrology during any given Pluto epoch. Here I'm defining epoch as the length of time Pluto is in a single sign. A friend pointed out to me that 18.5 years could be used to describe the generational transformations and changes, and this is, of course, the nodal cycle. But nodal cycles do not have descriptive variance, just as the Saturn and Jupiter cycle does not have much descriptive variance outside of perhaps the inception chart of when that cycle flips. Instead, we are going to look at Pluto through the signs, and the primary driver or underneath contributor towards an informer of the signs is the elements. When Pluto is in the earth elements, these signs are going to express themselves with practical matters of the materiality of being. Each has its own quality depending on its modality, whether cardinal, fixed, or immutable. By materiality, we mean what it is to be embodied and how that embodiment is enjoyed, experienced, and worked at in practical ways. Fixed earth, as Taurus, is consolidating an experience and seeking out the experience of centering itself. When Pluto is in mutable earth in Virgo, it's seeking a practical and synthesizing transformation. When Pluto is in cardinal earth in Capricorn, then the world soul is asserting the primacy of material matters, historic and archaeological truths. Now, when Pluto is in the water modality, these water signs express themselves by diving into the psyche and the emotions. They want to understand the intuitive and fluid nature of the emotions and being. During these periods, psychological, psychic, and intuitive astrology comes to the fore. Cardinal water will emphasize humanistic and nurturing forms of astrology. When Pluto is in mutable water signs, it will emphasize transformative emotional and psychological astrology. And finally, when Pluto is in fixed water signs, it will emphasize, again, spiritual, psychological, and intuitive forms of astrology in a deep and unmoving way. Now, when Pluto is in fire signs, there is a philosophical and practical attempt to defend astrology from the forces that constantly try to discredit it and narrow its meaning. This happens through debate as well as through revelation of new forms and techniques. Astrology expands from that defense of itself. All the cardinal signs also thrust new forms of astrology into the dialogue, interestingly enough. Pluto in cardinal fire marks a period of time when the art fights to justify its existence and also reveals itself in new forms. Pluto in fixed fire will forcibly justify its existence and demand attention. Pluto in mutable fire signs will expand the horizons of what astrology is by definition. New forms of astrology come into being, such as human design. When Pluto is in air signs, the art of astrology undergoes periods of synthesis, logical development, an outpouring of written works on the subject to help integrate its knowledge and language into the mainstream. Pluto in cardinal air will emphasize the balancing and dialogue of the art through fair-minded conversation and development. Pluto in mutable air explains astrology in terms that endears it to a more common knowledge of man and humanity and culture and societies at the time. Pluto in fixed air will expand astrology's use as a practical tool in the quest for humanitarian ideals and non-sectarian conversation. The generalities of the elements are flavored by the particulars of the archetype that Pluto occupies as it travels through the signs. As we go through each one, feel free to comment in the chat on how you see astrology being developed by Pluto in that sign that it's occupying at the time. The further back we go in history, though, I want to note that the fog of what was practiced and done becomes denser as we rely on fewer surviving books written by practitioners, as well as there is kind of what I would call a 0 point, where there are no living storytellers left of how the tradition was practiced at that time. This 0 point gives you an understanding of where myth starts to come into play, and we start to fantasize how astrology was practiced at that time through our own cultural projections. It's impossible, you see, to understand how people experienced and thought about their world 100 years ago, let alone 2,000 years ago, as they lived under completely different moral, societal, and experiential assumptions. All we have is what they wrote down. We don't have how they actually thought and communicated and talked about it to each other. We project our worldview onto them and make judgments from it. For that reason, I am limiting the scope of this historic review of Pluto to the last Pluto cycle starting in the previous time Pluto was in Aquarius. Even then, it's pretty hazy at the beginning. Moving back to that time, the understanding of the ideas of how astrology was practiced and understood is limited. I think Christopher Warnock makes this point very well in his course on Renaissance magic, where he says to fully practice that form of astrology, one has to study immensely what Renaissance thought was and come to accept that worldview and apply it to your understanding of Renaissance astrology. It's an interesting question to think about, at the least. Ooh, that's a rough slide. My apologies. For instance, we are very clear on techniques that Valens used. We have a wonderful book he wrote and has been translated through the efforts of Project Hindsight as well as others, and then clearly explained by some of the current living masters of the craft, such as Demetra George, Joseph Conrad, and Chris Brennan. What we are not clear on is how Valens spoke to clients in consultation. We will never know for certain how he spun his consultation language with clients. By the way, Anthologia, which was written and propagated when Pluto was in Taurus, an Earth sign. Hence, it is a very practical presentation on astrology. I had a wonderful conversation with Jen Zart at the Cayley Institute some months back, and she noted that even if we go back for the 70s, there's a lot of assumption about how astrology is practiced and how astrologers thought. If you get the chance, it's worth visiting the Cayley Institute because there is a plethora of books from between the 20s and 70s that are filled with nuanced gems coming from a time when there were many great practitioners of astrology. But the assumption is that the practice of astrology was relatively flat at that time. I think we'll see as we reach Pluto in Cancer that astrology was not flat at that time. Now, we're going to cover a vast amount of astrology in the next slides as we move through Pluto in each of the signs. And one thing I'd like to point out or help you to appreciate, help myself to appreciate, is that astrology really is a living lineage that never died out. It was passed from generation to generation with knowledge. But what happened as it moved through the Pluto changing the signs is it morphed, changed, and transformed. And what was emphasized fell from one topic to another. In the beginning, when Pluto was in Aquarius from 1778 through 1798, it brought with itself a yearning for a craft that served the furtherment of man and individual freedom. There was an air of theurgy that came with this at the time, as can be evidenced by the French astrologers during that period, such as Saint Martin. We find both a practical outlook, prophecies of enlightened societies during this time, and a decided turn to using the stars and planets as a pathway towards illumination, which will just grow as Pluto moves through the signs. During this epoch, we find the Western world in a state of upheaval, throwing off the yoke of being ruled by monarchy. The most noticeable examples of this are the French and American revolutions. Ebenezer Sibley, a prominent Masonic astrologer at the time, was very much into presenting that idea. He cast a chart for the founding of the United States, thinking it was a promise for an enlightened society. Masons such as Benjamin Franklin are recorded as having given astrological advice. And there's a page from a diary of George Washington where he notes the movements of the moon and the significant transits that are occurring. This is that page on the screen. And it's just like absolutely brilliant and fascinating to see that George Washington was knowledgeable within astrology. He made some of his choices based upon the motions of the stars. Masonic astrologers outwardly profess the importance of education, democracy, and human rights, which are in alignment with Pluto in Aquarius. And the theme of Aquarius is being about humanism, humanitarianism, and the enlightenment of all. Aquarius representing these themes. Sibley's charts incorporated Herschel into astrology. He was the first to do so. Herschel then being Uranus, which was a novel and a very Aquarian thing, especially now that we associate Uranus with Aquarius. Next, we find Pluto moving into Pisces from 1798 to 1823. When Pluto moved into Pisces, astrology took a more spiritualistic turn, one concerned with psychic phenomena, the ability to see the future, and continued the theme of the theurgic use of planets. The previous cycle in the 1550s of Pluto in Pisces also was a time when Nostradamus released his prophetic quatrains, which haunt us to this day. The works of Barrett, Eckartshausen, Bader recast astrology as a language of divine forces, along with the works of Saint Martin, all of which oriented towards a deep spiritual relationship to the planets and how they fit into the governing of the world soul itself, or an expression of the world soul. This period is a peak movement of astrology and the human relationship to the celestial realm as a concept of spiritual wholeness. As well, at the time, then the almanacs were still prolific, such as the Old Farmer's Almanac, relying on astrology to cast weather. There are also threads from this time and previous epochs of this time that reprinted Agrippa, such as in Francis Barrett's work, The Magus and the Celestial Astrologer. This time also reinvigorated the thread of talismans, amulets, and invocations of planetary spirits, which would later influence esotericists such as Eliphas Levi on his presentation of astrology. I'm going to be honest with you, it was a little bit hard to pin down exactly what was going on with astrology when Pluto was in Pisces, but that's very Piscean, which is incredibly hard to define, so that should be no surprise to anyone listening. Now, when Pluto entered Aries, we start to get a clearer picture of the individual influences upon the time. as the noted and famous astrologer Raphael begins to form a new way of looking at astrology, which has now become significantly challenged by the scientific community and thought, which is looking for empirical evidence of why astrology should be relied upon or counted upon. So this is a time where we see two unique trends that we can associate with Aries, which is a cardinal fire sign, combativeness and innovation within astrology. Robert Cross Smith, known as Raphael, releases his Manual of Astrology in 1828, which is the first seed of what is to become a modern astrology. Pluto moving into Aries starts to emphasize the individual. And from this point, from this seed, the idea that astrology is about individual fulfillment rather than just practical matters starts taking root. This is a result of astrology coming under severe attack from rationalists who began in earnest seeking to dispel the idea that prediction in astrology is an infallible art. They start pointing out that oftentimes predictions do not manifest. Although Raphael propagates medical astrology, there is also a serious effort at this time to show through empirical analysis that there is no correlation between illness and the movements of the heavenly bodies. His contemporary, Zadkiel, Richard James Morrison, continues to promote weather astrology during this time, which receives tremendous kickback from the fledgling art of meteorology, which scoffs at it and says you cannot tell whether it's going to rain or not from the motions in the stars. So this proposes that weather patterns are only a terrestrial phenomena. They are not influenced by the movements of the stars. And astrology is a little bit on its back feet, contributing towards material understanding of how the world works. Now, how is astrology going to react to this? Another bold transformation of this time is that they both begin propagating the Placidus health system. The cardinal signs of each element are strong indicators of new forms of astrology being born and integrated into the human psyche. After the cardinal signs, the following fixed element is a time when those new forms become fixed in the practice of astrologers. Finally, the mutable signs show a break in the previous form to allow the new form to be born. As we continue to move with the motions of Pluto through the signs, you'll see this pattern arising over and over again. Pluto in Taurus, 1853 to 1884, is a time when Eliphas Levi and his student Pappus turn astrology in a path to pursue magic. During this time, there is an effort to create a sacred path that is not oriented towards the previous dominant Christian structures and theologies that were marking astrologies, bringing it back perhaps to its forgotten universalist, pagan, earth-centered spiritual ideals. This association with Taurus here should be plainly apparent. At the same time, we can see clearly that the art of astrology is now starting to be considered a personal quest rather than a mechanism of worldly fate. The world soul is starting to turn towards the human finding its own identity within it. During this time, we also see the school of Zadkiel II and the continuing school of Raphael work to create usable planetary tables so that astrology is accessible to all people who are not just science or who are not highly learned. In this way, astrology becomes more accessible to the general public as a personal practice, no longer being solely the domain of those who produce almanacs. L.D. Broughton then carries on this thread of natal astrology and medical astrology in the US at the time, offering a practical use of astrology that is both oriented towards practical matters and political considerations, as well as personal daily duties. While this has long been a tradition in Europe, Broughton's monthly planet reader at this time is the first dedicated astrological journal in the United States. Next, we see Pluto moving into Gemini, and it does so, as it does so, the discourse of what astrology is becomes very fervent. We really start getting into the meat of how the world soul is moving astrology into a personal experience and practice. Pluto in Gemini is incredibly inventive. Alan Leo, born William Frederick Allen, and Evangeline Adams bring astrology into the modern world by what traditionalists might say is creating a surface polemic that can be understood through conversation and the exchange of ideas. Sun sign astrology and psychological astrology start to appear as forms of astrology in the public experience for the first time. Is this good or is this shallow? Does it matter? Well, not really. Now everyone at any cocktail party in Upper New York can identify their sign. Alan Leo is often considered the father of modern astrology. He was a devout theosophist, incorporated concepts of karma and reincarnation into his explanation of astrology, which he disseminated widely through his theosophical network. It seems fair to say that the ability of Gemini to explore a multitude of ideas expresses itself as Pluto is in this sign, in Alan Leo's expansion and redefining of astrology through synthesizing novel ideas in the craft. Now, as you may know, he faced a lawsuit during this time and was accused of practicing prophecy and had to defend himself. And he did so by saying astrology is about personal fulfillment, not necessarily about prophecy or prediction. He said, the sun and planets represent the spiritual consciousness in the heaven world. The sign of the zodiac represents the astral or psychic consciousness, and the houses of the horoscope as a whole represent the physical consciousness. In Introduction to Esoteric Astrology. This illustrates how it is the turning of the idea of astrology and the beginning of that into an inner psychological and metaphysical art form from a predictive art. We start seeing a lot less of astrology as being about prediction at this point. The philosophy of Western astrology starts to spread worldwide as its magical practice and implications for personal development start catching on. Astrology lodges proliferate, and the Astrological Lodge of London is formed at the end of this period, a time and place where astrology can be discussed, as Geminis are wont to do. Another quality of Gemini is that Alan Leo and the astrologers at the time start becoming prolific in their publishing. Alan Leo himself now puts out 10 different books. Evangeline Adams puts out 8 books, although there's some controversy about whether those were actually her books or if they are ghostwritten by Aleister Crowley. Now, Gemini is a bit of a trickster sign, so it's possible they were ghostwritten. Pluto moves into Cancer from 1914 to 1939. During this time, psychological astrology becomes fully formed within the context of a water sign. So it's a time to start talking about your feelings. Dane Rudhyar and Carl Jung start using astrology as a tool for psychological insight into the persona. Astrology reveals itself as a pathway to quickly getting through the hard outer shell of the persona into the soft inner and pliable parts of the human. To this day, astrologers recognize the value of this use of astrology, which has now become fully formed. Alice Bailey's Theosophical Astrology becomes fully formed also at this time. And remember, Cancer as a cardinal modality of water, expressing a grand, unique spiritual view, which is soul-centered and an individual approach to the art. The same being symbols also come into existence during this cardinal water time through the revelations of Mark Edward Jones and the clairvoyant Elsie Wheeler. The forceful nature of cardinal water is really evident. The Cosmobiology School is also born and revealed at this time by Alfred Witt. Although it is not until the very end of Pluto in Leo that Witt releases the groundbreaking work Rules for Planetary Pictures, which explains the practice of Uranian astrology. I myself am not familiar enough with Uranian astrology in a school to understand how it might correlate to the ideas of Cancer. If you are, please put them in the chat. It would be, I think, also sacrilegious not to mention that at this time, Aleister Crowley produced his works, Astrology, Your Place in the Sun, in 1927, and Astrology, Your Place in the Stars, in 1930, which is another cardinal inception of astrology, this time focusing on its use in thelemic works and chaos magic, a form that becomes very popular when Pluto next hits a water sign in Scorpio. From 1939 to 1958, Pluto moves into Leo. Astrology starts becoming very vibrant in wealthy circles. Dane Rudhyar during this time fixes and solidifies psychological astrology. We begin to see the beginnings of pop astrology too. Believe it or not, it's really the time when sun signs astrology is born. I know it's Pluto in Leo, and so this becomes a worldwide staple during this time. Newspapers and magazines start carrying your sun sign. Sidney Omar launches his daily column in 1951. Brenton Schreier, who worked with Omar at the United Press News Service in the early 50s, says Omar was valued by his readers, not because they believe every word he wrote, but because it always contained threads of hope and encouragement, the warmth of the sun and the warmth of Leo. It is a time when astrology also starts finding purpose for giving individuals meaning. This quote illustrates how it may be seen as a backdrop against the unspeakable mass horrors and nihilism of World War II. People needed hope and meaning. It is during this period that the move towards psychological astrology rather than predictive astrology or spiritually emphasized astrology takes a very strong root. It is not that predictive or spiritual astrology die out during this time. They rather become a substrain held by theosophists, occultists, and serious students of the art. Dane Rudhyar, Grant Louis, with his popular astrology work, Astrology for the Millions, and Isabel Hickey, with her work, Astrology, a Cosmic Science, solidify the emphasis of astrology as a cause for, again, a Leo theme, individual empowerment and psychological self-determination over fate. This trend will last until we reach Pluto in Scorpio, when the fated astrologers make a comeback. Hollywood and the stars, also began to adapt astrology through the works of Muriel Kingsley, who becomes known as the astrologer to the stars during this period. Pluto in Virgo from 1958 to 1972 brings about with it a time when Dane Rudhyar, Isabel Hickey continued to develop the theme of psychological astrology, and outside of the cosmobiology school, it grows as becoming the dominant form of astrology. That's right, analysis of Virgo theme becomes the dominant form of astrology. Hickey notes at this time in her work Astrology, a Cosmic Science, that the natal chart is not a form of judgment, but a map of healing. Virgo themes of forgiveness and inner purification through understanding of the symbols of astrology and how they play out in the birth chart are brought to the fore. She says, there is nothing in a horoscope that the blueprint, the pattern, that you cannot change if you want to. I've seen this over years. It's the story of the cycles and rhythms that you're going through and what you have brought over from the past to work out. It shows your character, which is a very practical earth thing to say about astrology. Stephen Arroyo during this time writes Astrology, Psychology, and the Four Elements, although it's not published until 76. At this time, which brings astrology firmly into the realm of the therapeutic, accessible language to the lay practitioner. Also, practical earth element themes arise during this time in the astrology field. The Gauguin studies are released, applying statistical analysis to birth data, gathering over 25,000 verified birth charts and proving that Mars on an angle does indeed have an effect. There's a Virgo analytical impact that occurs in the practice of astrology, then, which rekindles an effort to prove that it may have some scientific validity. The growth of data as used for astrology in the beginning of the computer age is fully embraced by Charles Jane in the 1960s, another sign of the changing nature of astrology that is common when Pluto is in mutable signs. At this time, then, a young man named Robert Hand starts applying computer analysis to astrology charts, and also brings exploring traditional astrological techniques along with cosmobiology and psychological astrology together, setting the tone for the next phase of transmutation of the art as Pluto moves into Libra from 1972 to 1984. While Pluto is in Libra, the astrological renaissance begins to grow from its seeds in the 60s into a full-grown fruiting tree. Linda Goodman becomes incredibly popular, writing accessible astrology books for the general public. There is this surface aesthetic quality to her presentation that is beautiful and compelling and highly consumable to the public. Underneath it all, there is also some incredible changes to the traditional astrology brewing, as is usual when Pluto is in cardinal signs. You'll probably not be surprised to learn that relationship astrology becomes a key component of the art when Pluto is in Libra. Rob Hand releases Planets in Composite, analyzing human relationships. Liz Green releases Relating, an astrological guide to living with others on a small planet. And Arroyos releases Relationships and Life Cycles in 1979. The practice of relationships and compatibility analysis becomes reinvigorated from its ancient roots of matchmaking and synastry and comparison charts. We are now close enough to our own point in time that most of us know these authors, books, and ideas that start to come to the fore while Pluto's in Libra. Astrology then reflects the world soul and its intentions to bring the reintegration of the feminine into the modern Western human consciousness, starting with the work of Liz Green and the exploration of Saturn in her book, Saturn, A New Look at an Old Devil, which explores that there are feminine qualities and sides to the hard-edged Saturn and its influences on the psyche. She says, Saturn led the way in one of the triumphs of modern astrology in showing the combination of acceptance, understanding, and the ability to perceive alternate choices with increased awareness is the variable that can change the way in which one experiences one chart and one's life. These seeds of innovation start forming that will play out during the next cycle of the modalities. Hand, Jeffrey Green, Zoller, Schmidt, Sasportas, Liz Green, amongst many others, begin to pull astrology back out of the self-oriented focus that it has been in during the previous modality cycle. From this period, a number of new schools begin to form. Libra being an air sign, the computer technology revolution also begins to fully integrate into astrology. By the end of this period, with mass adoption of the computerized charts, which begin to phase out hand-calculated charts. Robert Zoller's books, The Keys to Loss Prediction, becomes a seed of what is to become a full-fledged revitalization of traditional astrology by the end of the cycles of elements and modalities that we are currently in. Also during this time, note that the rebirth of astrological magic is seeded into the publication by Stephen Skinner's technique of high magic, which includes planetary correspondences and invocations based on the old works of Agrippa and the Golden Dawn. Now we're going to come into a time period where there are so many astrologers, authors, teachers, and schools that I'm not going to mention probably the vast majority of them. And I ask for your forgiveness in that. There's only so much we can cover in a short 60 to 90-minute talk. Pluto enters Scorpio from 1984 to 1995. During this time, it is completely transformational to the art of astrology, as one might expect for Pluto being in Scorpio, the sign of transformation. There is a deep dive into the nuances of the soul and how it can be expressed and discovered during this time. The awareness of Pluto and soul-based astrology grows into its own school known as evolutionary astrology, a distinctly scorpionic idea, and it becomes a fixed feature of astrology from here on. This is through the efforts of Jeffrey Wolf Green, releasing Pluto, the evolutionary journey of the soul, and Stephen Forrest releasing The Inner Sky. Along with this, we see a feminine current gaining hold and moving forward, with Demetra George introducing the asteroid goddesses to the world with her work, Asteroid Goddesses, the mythology, psychology, and astrology of the re-emerging feminine, being published in 1986. This work also rapidly expands the use of asteroids in astrology, a trend which is still growing to this day. Barbara Hand-Clow and Melanie Reinhardt introduced Chiron as a topic, the wounded healer, and it becomes a deeply valuable symbol whose delineation in charts provides profound insight. This resonates with the theme of poison that is associated both with Scorpio and Pluto. Scorpio is a deeply spiritual sign, and we also find Jan Spiller comes out at this time with her book Spiritual Astrology in 1982, whose concepts really began taking off. At this time, planetary magic begins to rise in popularity, and astrology as a basis of magical practice starts to become more mainstream again. The first modern publication of Agrippa's 3 books of occult philosophy and the first modern translation of Picatrix are released. This is very Scorpionic indeed. A completely new form of astrology was born in the 80s also, human design, which comes forth in 1987 when Alan Crowker, who later changes his names to Ra Ohuhu, receives it as a divine revelation in a period of 8 days, although it does not come to fruition really until Pluto enters Sagittarius from 1995 to 2008. This is a time of an explosion in astrological philosophy, practice, and knowledge coming out of Europe, the US, and England, as well the Chinese forms of Ba Qi and the Indian Yoitis astrology grow ever more popular. The expanding internet allows for a worldwide conversation of what is astrology and how to practice it. This correlates with Sagittarius' unbounded nature of expansion while Pluto is within it. Sagittarius has the fire of exploration and the inquiry of philosophy as a core part of its symbology. Pluto in Sagittarius then opens up the philosophical inquiry into astrology, what its roots are, and how it plays out in our everyday lives. During this time, we see the peak unfolding of Project Hindsight, rediscovering the historic roots of astrology. In doing so, Western astrology's fundamental connection to Neoplatonism comes to the fore of the craft. Evolutionary astrology, with its grand themes of how the soul evolves through the conscious awareness of one's astrological chart, blossoms. Jan Spiller releases New Moon Astrology, the secret of astrological timing to revitalize your life, which lends itself to conscious agency and manifesting, which is a very Sagittarius idea. One of the more esoteric sides is that John Michael Greer and Christopher Warnock become very active in putting out astrological magical texts during this time, which is in the same theme and idea of manifesting as Jan Spiller's works, but from a completely different angle. Jeffrey Cornelius contributes to the conversation, tackling the idea of and philosophy of what astrology is with his work, The Moment of Astrology. And we find Bernadette Brady at this time releasing The Eagle and the Lark and her book on fixed stars and pushing the synthesis of myth and traditional techniques as a whole and being a mark of a good astrologer. As is typical with mutable signs, this lays the groundwork for many astrological themes that will become dominant during the upcoming cardinal modality of the Earth sign, Capricorn. But before we get there, finally, let's take note that during this time, Astrodiance and Deb Holding's Skyscript also become global online forums for the learning and discussion of astrology. Solar Fire, Kepler, and Janus become widespread softwares. And also, then we find that there's no longer even maybe a need to do hand chart calculations, which expands the possibility of astrology being practiced by almost anyone. It is also then, during this time, that Richard Tarnas releases his expansive view of astrology as a means for cultural understanding through the magnificent work Cosmos and Psyche, forming what will become known as archetypal astrology. So we can see clearly that as Pluto moved through Sagittarius, the idea of what astrology is, how it practices, and who practices is expanded exponentially and globally, as anything should do when it is being influenced by Sagittarius. Next, when Pluto moves into Capricorn, we get a consolidation of the various schools of astrology beginning to occur with almost more intense than usual bickering of what is the correct type of astrology. A type of fundamentalism, maybe, concerning what is true and what is not, which is very Capricornian, rears its Hydra head. This age is fresh in all of our minds as we've all just lived through it, and perhaps not much needs to be said about it. The Capricorn themes of astrology as a practical tool arises as traditional Greek astrology become very popular with the youth. The idea of astrology as a tool for prediction rather than psychological analysis begins to gain hold again. Or the idea that astrology is a revitalization of the soul and the work that was done during the Neoplatonic times takes root. Through the efforts of Demetra George and Chris Brennan, Greek astrology becomes a very practical form and practiced form of predictive astrology that comes to the fore. Also, there is a renaissance of medieval astrology that comes to the fore during this time, all of which are very practical in creating meaningful predictions of what one will experience in their life. This is incredibly Capricornian. It is the idea that there is something very solid that can be done with astrology. That's not the ephemeral internal view of the soul or the psyche or psychology. However, at the same time, the evolutionary astrology lineages through the works of Stephen Forrest and his contemporaries becomes broad-based and institutional. While this is happening, the astrological organizations and conferences grow in popularity and energy as astrology starts to arise and surge in popularity in the mainstream. As a response to this, astrological organizations form strong training regimens, again, very Capricornian in theme, which embrace ethics, solid educational foundations, rigorous learning, and outreach for practitioners of the craft. There's also an explosion of energy in young astrologers who see the art of astrology as providing real material meaning in a world that grows ever secular and cynical in its political and materialistic leanings. A practical orientation to astrology takes place during this time, and we see the rise of those astrologers through social media, and good business astrology starts showing how the craft can become a successful path to wealth and a successful business. The rise of app culture, however, puts portable astrology in everyone's pocket. At this time, the debate about whether astrology is a craft of fate or free will becomes very heated in social media outlets, as does the concretization and fundamentalization of the different schools of astrology. Suddenly, traditional astrologers can no longer stand psychological and evolutionary astrologers, and vice versa. This is very par for the course for Capricorn, which is a rigid sign. Finally, we come to where we are in our present moment. Pluto is again back in Aquarius. What will become of astrology over the next 20 years? If you have some ideas and theories, please feel free to put them in the chat. I would love to read them later on when I review this talk. During this time, we are faced with difficult questions as a field. We face the daunting AI absorption of astrology. This poses a novel challenge to assumptions about the craft itself, about if astrology is just technical calculations and percentages. If it is, an AI can do all of that with superior efficiency to us, the humans who practice astrology, and the craft may die out as a craft that is practiced by humans. Software will replace us. Is this the world soul's intentions? Is it moving into a cold mechanical way? That would be an Aquarian theme. However, if astrology is a creative soul-based art, which I believe it is, that requires laziness, imagination, symbolic associations, contemplations, meditations, and humanness, then we still have a secure profession and purpose in translating the language of nous, the impulse of the world soul, into this human realm. Aquarius is a time of humanitarianism. And usually Pluto in Aquarius creates a growth of humanitarian ideals, and all of what I just mentioned is humanitarian. It might not seem like that is where the world is going currently, but it probably did not seem that way in the beginning of 1778 either, when Pluto had just entered Aquarius, and the entire Western world was locked in a battle with authoritarian kings and rulers who were absorbing the wealth of the masses and refusing to cede power. Not that that has any resonance with now. A key theme of Aquarius is the individuation of the soul, as well as the common good of the community. It is my hope then that we see astrology start to resynthesize and appreciate the richness of the entire tradition and all of its diverse forms. the upcoming UAC conference, which I hope you all go to, the ongoing education provided by Kepler and OPA, as well as ISAR and NOAC, the Astrology Co-op, AFA, AYA, and the School of Traditional Astrology, and the London School of Traditional Astrology, just to name a few, continue the work of the synthesis of the astrological tradition as a whole and the development of astrologers who can speak for the world soul. My intent in this presentation was to show the stream of astrology as a living lineage, its borders and its shapes defined by the motions of Pluto through the signs of the world soul, speaking to humans through it, as Rob Hand said eloquently in his keynote lecture in NORAC 2018, The Language of Astrology. As astrologists, we are guides of humans, not just in the process of self-discovery, relationship, or immediate material needs and concerns, but also in helping humans to express their path and helping express the path that humanity itself takes and ensures it is aligned with the intentions of the universe. It has been this way, though, from the very beginning. For the very first astrological priest who climbed the ziggurats of Ur back in the 4th millennial BC and read the omens of the stars, were interpreting the intention of the world soul when they climbed down and formed the king of the best actions and rituals he should undertake for the people. This is the lineage we come from, and this is the lineage we are a continuing part of. It is in this tradition that astrologers are guides to the one and the many, which is symbolized by the Aquarian water bearer, solitary but holding the good of the collective in its arms. To practice astrology in this age is to participate consciously in the conversation of the world soul, to recognize that every chart, every consultation is a small current in a much larger river of meaning. We do not own this tradition, we tend it, ensuring that its waters remain clear and vital as they pass through us to those who will come after. As we approach the art and craft of astrology during this time as individuals who are contributing to the conversational stream of what it is to be human, what is your contribution? What is your unique style? And how are you going to contribute to and craft humanity? That is my question that I leave you to ponder as we finish this conversation. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Dorje. Fascinating. And you're getting some positive reactions, lots of hearts in the chat
Oh, I love
here.
the hearts. Thank you. Those hearts make me feel so good.
So I invite everyone to pop any questions they have into the Q&A box, and there were some in there already. So we'll be getting to those shortly, and you're getting a lot of fandom in the chat box. That's
Oh,
wonderful.
I love
Thanks, everyone.
fandom too. Thank you.
So we'll start off with the first question. Bo asked, what do you feel will be the biggest challenge for the Pluto and Leo generation as they experience the opposition from Pluto and Aquarius?
I think the biggest challenge, and my contemplation of this is maybe looking at the whole of society, not just from an astrological perspective, is letting the community start taking lead. The ideal of humanitarianism start taking lead. And I think, this was really highlighted, not to be political, but by, Biden holding power to the very end, perhaps by our current president holding power, when we really have a lot of young, vital people who are like, hey, no, we are a community. We are a people who all need to be helped and supported. So it's letting go. It's letting go because the fluidity of the world soul moving through Pluto moving through the signs is that once Pluto hits the opposite sign, it becomes a time of letting go for that initial sign.
Indeed. Yeah, stepping down off the throne.
Stepping literally.
And then Sarah asked, she has had many friends in high school. She's died suddenly. She has Pluto in the 7th. Is that common, do you think, to have trauma around your relationships with Pluto in the 7th?
From a Pluto perspective, yes, I would have to look at your entire chart, Sarah, to really comment on why that might be an experience for you and the mythological, personal, and soul developmental meaning for why that is happening and how you can grow from it.
Great. And Jake asks, are there any special challenges or meanings during cusps or transitions with your work? Does Pluto from Capricorn to Aquarius have special or differentiated meaning to you compared to purely Pluto in Capricorn or Pluto in Aquarius, those transitional moments?
I believe those transitional moments are times of intense what would I say, dynamic reflection that occur within the craft as Pluto moves through the different signs and how the world soul expresses through it. And you can look at it like when Pluto moved from Capricorn to Aquarius, that was the time of COVID. Everybody went online, everybody stopped talking to each other. And the astrology schools really went at it at that time online. Well, traditional astrology versus evolutionary astrology, whole sign versus quadrant-based signs. There was just such this dynamic tension, and we're starting to see a little bit of a relaxation of that. And so that is a common theme during the movements of the Pluto through the cusps.
Fascinating. And Elizabeth asks, in the same vein as the Leo generation with the opposition, how about Scorpio, Pluto and Scorpio generation with the square coming on? How would you interpret that on a generational scale with a square aspect?
I mean, every generation experiences this, and it's just a time of self-reflection and development, as what you see is you're calling to rise with your soul's intentions and knowledge and use that energy to help guide humanity, yourself, and those who you know and love in a positive way. So it's a time of friction and intensity that calls upon you to mature into being a caretaker and guardian of what you hold and value as dear, rather than to just be part of the learning process and your expression of that sign.
Thank you. And then Lisa asks, for your Pluto and Gemini slide, the quote from Alan Leo, do you see that corresponding to the three bodies of Buddha?
Oh my gosh, I never thought about it in that way. The three bodies of Buddha being the Dharmakaya, the Sambhogakaya, and the Nirmanakaya. The Dharmakaya being mind, Sambhogakaya being the experience of energy within the context of that mind, and Nirmanakaya being the physical form or the form of that mind. Maybe there's a loose tangential thing, but I think it's kind of you get into danger when you really try to associate very different concepts into having the same meaning. The danger that Joseph Campbell walked into quite often fearlessly.
And then John asks about the significance of whole sign houses. I'm not sure, John, maybe you could expound on that question. Or Dorje, do you understand where John's coming from with that?
Practitioner whole sign houses, I find the significance to be that they have very strong Neoplatonic harmonies within them when they're used, and they do tend to tell stories through changes of the planets that are very palpable, very, very workable. You do lose some of the detailed of information that you get from planet aspecting cusps and quadrant-based houses. So there's a give and a take. I'm not one who takes the position as one is better than the other. I just practice whole sign through familiarity at this point.
Hmm. It's interesting because I think everybody on a mundane level would say that the transition from whole sign houses is palpable, right? Whether or not it aspects a cusp, even if you use a quadrant-based system. So it's fascinating.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Do you find though, Mary, that the trend that the aspect to a cusp in mundane astrology from a quadrant-based house has significance or is a cause of events?
I mean, mundane, I'm not so sure. I'd have to really look into it more, but definitely from a horary astrology perspective, like cusp boundaries are very much integrated into the practice and the technique. So I would imagine because horary and mundane are kind of inextricably linked, they evolved from the same time period that that perhaps, yeah, it would be helpful to. But if you're looking at more specific instances of events or cities that had like the founding of the chart of Rome or Baghdad, I think
Hmm.
when you focus in on those historical events rather than maybe the continuum of now, where, I mean, as soon as Pluto moved into Aquarius again, last winter, we were getting all the cables being cut undersea, like all
Right.
sorts of hybrid, stealthy underwater warfare stuff, So
Yeah.
you can observe that on a mundane level, but it wasn't necessarily hitting a cusp of anything that we knew of. But I think if you had specific charts of historical events, you could definitely maybe
Fantastic.
point to
Absolutely.
that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Pluto moving into Aquarius was like a hammer. I mean, the age of drone warfare just like immediately rose. The age of AI immediately rose. The age of alternative energy, although there's some Pluto and Leo people who are trying to suppress it, immediately surged into the world's soul and the understanding of the human experience. It was so incredibly loud.
Hmm. Indeed. Uh, Carrie asked, someone on TikTok said that Pluto can also represent your love life. She thought that was interesting. And what's your take on that? Maybe I don't know how you want to think of your love life, but
Yeah, Pluto is deep urges. So, like, if you have deep urges that you need to express through your love life, yeah, absolutely look to Pluto. It's going to tell you about some of those deep urges. It's going to tell you about that shadow part of yourself. And I don't mean necessarily bad by shadow. I mean the parts of yourself that are unconscious, which then become reflected to you when you engage in a relationship, ideally based on love. You start reflecting the partner reflects your unconsciousness, your shadow to you, which is not necessarily bad, by pointing out what are your habitual tendencies. And this is part of how Pluto expresses what is not seen and brings it to the surface of consciousness, which I think is explored very well in evolutionary astrology.
Mhm. And, there are many different types of love. The Greeks had several different
Oh
words
boy.
for different experiences of love, and maybe that platonic love is glamorized in our culture right now, that fatal attraction type of love that is a little bit more on the
Yeah, yeah.
platonic side,
Yeah,
right?
the eros, love as eros is, but it is love as familia that then will help reflect your unconsciousness to you and help you work through it and heal it and move on into more functional habits as a human. And so the different types of love are all going to be required for handling the energy of Pluto. But certainly it's the eros which will immediately create that fatal attraction that brings two people together to start working out their deep issues.
And Francis asks, wondering why astrosophy rarely gets a mention. Rudolf Steiner introduced the concept for the future and was working with the ideas of karma and reincarnation and healing, not least with children with special needs back around 1920 and before. What's your take on
It's
that?
Rudolf Steiner's absolutely brilliant, and again, like the subject matter of the living lineage of astrology is so incredibly dense and rich. I apologize for forgetting Rudolf Steiner. Maybe it is your work to help bring that into a greater level of consciousness, because the Rudolf Steiner's teachings are absolutely brilliant, healing, and worthy to be spread within the human consciousness of the world soul. So please carry on that work if you find that that is misrepresented or underrepresented, because his words need to be heard.
Indeed. And Ariel, hi Ariel. Ariel asks, do you have any thoughts on Pluto's declination and its out of bounds status at the moment? I know Rosie Finn has been publishing some work on that
Yeah,
recently.
the out of bound planets are terrible, destructive, horrible things. Pluto is a terrible, destructive, horrible thing on its own when not handled with any consciousness whatsoever. It seems like we have some very unconscious people handling the power of Pluto out of bounds right now. So my thoughts are, wish us all luck, everybody. We got to get through this.
And maybe other people in the audience know are more familiar with Rosie's work, but I think she's pointing out that Pluto has gone out of bounds in the southern declination, so that corresponds historically with people's movements, revolutions. So it may be another testimony towards a Pluto in Aquarius type manifestation.
Yeah, and it's my understanding that the out of bounds occur in the same places, in the same signs. So that would be like, okay, the out of bounds revolutions that occur when Pluto is out of bounds at a southern declaration would always be occurring at the beginning and through Aquarius, which is what we saw last time Pluto was in Aquarius.
Hmm. Fascinating. All right. Anyone else, please put your questions in the chat. Right now, that's about it. Thank you so much, Dorje. This has been a fascinating meditation on Pluto, and I love the way you connected it to the practice of astrology generationally and the evolution of that. It's a pretty neat thing to observe.
Yeah,
And very
thank you.
meta reflection as astrologers.
Thank you very much. It's been an honor, everyone. And one thing that I hope I got across from that is we are part of a living tradition that is very, very, very ancient and old. And there are ideas that that tradition got broken, but I don't see evidence from that. I just see practices and forms of astrology come in and out of being. But the craft of astrology is very much continuous, and we are part of that craft. So, if you're a practicing astrologer listening right now, if you're studying astrology, if you're learning astrology, if you're going to Kepler, if you're part of any of these other organizations, put your heart into it. You're contributing to how man understands himself. And that's the intention of this presentation. So I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you very much and hope to see you again in the future. And sorry it was so dense and condensed. This really could have been 6 weeks, but it was 65 minutes. Thank you very much.
All right, I think Mary is frozen. There was one question, George, that we missed. Do you have time for one other question?
Yeah, 5 more minutes. Let's go.
Okay, sure. So Diane asks, Switzerland has had a direct democracy since the 1300s. Do you see the world
Incredible.
moving towards that type of democracy during Pluto and Aquarius?
I would love to hope that's the case. Dan Waits, the astrologer, did a very compelling argument as to that democracy stops flourishing when Pluto moves, or when the Jupiter Saturn moves into the air trigon, and democracy flourishes when Jupiter and Saturn are in the Earth trigon, as it was during the entire previous 300 years. So the end of that flourishing doesn't necessarily mean that Switzerland loses its democracy or different parts lose its democracy, but it does mean, and right now it's looking like it's at a tendency towards democracy no longer becomes the most noble ideal experience that the nations are striving towards. I hope that's not the case. I hope we're striving towards a worldwide humanitarianism and democratic movement, and this is just a retrograde hiccup. But I think Dan Waite's argument, which you can find on his YouTube channel, is very compelling.
And I think that would also apply to Shinobu's question, who mentioned about a similar thing, democracy being killed in Japan right now by far-right
Right. Yeah.
populism. So yeah, I think that would apply as well.
Well, and part of the understanding of being an astrologer who correlates with the world soul is you get this perspective that what we want for the world isn't necessarily what the world soul is doing. And so we can have these ideals of humanitarianism and democracy and equal rights and freedom, and that can be what we want, but that's not necessarily the way that humanity is going to move. And the study of mundane astrology really is an educational lesson in that. You don't always get what you want, but you can consciously integrate your own freedom through your practice.
Great. Let us see. So it is hard because I know we're short on time. There are a few more questions, but
Oh boy.
do you want to?
Yeah, let's do
Yeah,
a few
Dorje.
more. Let's yeah.
Okay, awesome.
Yeah, just cut it
Okay.
off whenever you want, Mary.
Okay,
Do you
yeah, I
want to go,
might just
Mary?
drop out.
Okay.
Pluto might just ruin my internet, so as it has been doing, really activating my anxious Pluto and Virgo.
I guess one of the questions that's come through, Kathleen asks, how will this Pluto cycle affect the finances of the US and the world? And I don't know. What do you think about that? I don't know if you're a financial astrologer as well, but
I dabble in it. I'm friends with Cryptodamus and other financial astrologers who I think are really wonderful people to ask these questions to when they come to Kepler and talk. But my own take on it is we are moving towards a more fluid digital financial economy based upon the idea that Aquarius is an air sign that is electric and digital in my mind. And therefore, it seems reasonable that as we're in this Aquarian period, not just marked by Pluto in Aquarius, but also the great conjunctions in Aquarius, that finances become more digital.
great. I I think that's a wrap. Mary,
Okay.
anything else from you? Yeah, I
I
don't want
I
to
have
hold
one
you.
question about how maybe you do you have a vision for how Pluto in the great sextile next year is going to play out when we have this amazing integration and interaction of all the outer planets at 4 degrees of their respective signs, with Jupiter in Leo opposed Pluto and the moon in Libra. I think it's in the middle to end of July. If you have thought about that or and its implications.
I'm have not put enough study into that currently to want to say anything on record. I mean, those are very kind of nuanced transits, and of course, we're living through right now. I think with the Neptune at the Aries point, a time when it is very hard to see what's coming up next due to the nature of Neptune being obscuring. But I do know that Kepler is hosting a panel for 2026, which I'm looking forward to attending, and hope addresses that question in detail.
Great, thank you. Well, with that, I think we'll close the webinar. Thank you so much, Dorje, for sharing your wisdom with us. We really appreciate it. And thank you to all of our attendees and our Kepler webinar community. We so appreciate you. And we'll see you next time.
Thank you, everybody. Goodbye.